Yeah, so it's about 3:09 a.m. here in Texas.
Acha, you don't sleep or what?
Well, I usually get up early in the morning anyhow. Yeah, like 24 hours from now, I'll be back at my job working. So I got up at midnight today. So.
Well, the first thing I just wanted to ask you off the bat is, I mean, because I've been observing you, and I messaged you also that I like your productivity. I mean, how do you do it I mean, right now you're what, 65 born, right? So you're.
Yeah, 1965 I was born. I mean, I just between 12 and 3, I'm a bit anal retentive in certain things. Like tomorrow, the company I work for. I mean, if you want to talk about politics and my opinions outside of the arts, we can do that later in the interview, because you're in India, and I think probably a lot of people outside of America think, well, they either hate America with just cause, or they think America is still the land of golden opportunity, which it never was. America is the biggest exploiter of people, and it's not just people of color, quote unquote. I'm as white as you. You have to be an albino to be whiter than me. I'm half Norwegian, a quarter Russian, a quarter German. But I've worked and busted my ass for. I mean, I started working when I was 6. No, I wasn't punching a clock, but in terms of making money to have little things. I mean, I grew up not super poor, not deli with people laying in open sewers. But I grew up working class poor. We didn't have a lot. We had to forego a lot of things that a lot of people didn't have to do. And again, growing up in America, being poor, the poorest people in America are still a couple of notches up from the poorest people in Africa or South America or in the subcontinent.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it's just one of those things that art, in a sense, is an escape. I mean, I don't do it in the politically correct sense to escape, but when I'm like, I just did 2,000 words in the last couple of hours on my last of the great Khan's play, a play I'm doing on Kubla Khan, and it's more complex than the first 2 plays that I'm doing, but you have to do it. And I can't, if I'm going to move my camera here, I don't know if you can see, there is one of my desktops there. You can see all the Post-it notes.
Yeah.
Whenever I get ideas for things, I write things down. I carry a little notebook when I get to work with my notebook here. So here's my little work notebook when I write things down that I have to do tomorrow, or how to try to save time. So that's an anal retentive thing, and it's a bad thing in life, because my wife is always yelling at me, because she'll say, don't care about the job. I think I might have mentioned, I've mentioned in a lot of these videos and whatnot, a few years ago, I had been fired from a job I worked almost a decade at, because I'm a decent person and they were breaking the law, and I followed the company rules, and they fired me. And this is if you want to go into a digression about politics and the hypocrisy of America, I'm willing to do that, but let's talk about art first.
Yeah. No, I mean, I completely understand. It's pretty much the same everywhere if you think about it, So one thing I found out was you grew up in Missouri Synod Lutheran. That's like some kind of church or something.
Missouri is a state in almost the dead center of the continental U.S.
Yeah.
Excluding Alaska and Hawaii. And the Lutherans, I don't know if you know, they're one of the Protestants. The Christians have Catholics, which are Roman and Eastern Orthodox Catholics, and then there's the Protestants, which is probably about 250 minor denominations. The first Protestants were Lutherans. After Martin Luther, he banged up his, I think, 95 Theses, which he objected to the Roman Catholic Church. And the Missouri Synod is, I guess, the equivalent of, I was going to say, I'm trying to think if there's any Muslim equivalent or something, but then the Lutherans are further broken up into, there's ELCA, ELCA, which is Ecumenical Lutheran Council of America, and then there's the Missouri Synod, and so there's a schism within a schism within a schism within a schism.
Yeah.
It's just crazy with the way religion is. And this was supposedly the more extreme or the more conservative type of Lutheranism. Lutherans are not like Roman Catholics. They don't like all the gold, and they don't like all the flowery stuff. They don't believe in spirits. They don't believe in saints. A Lutheran is, next to a Calvinist, if you know who John Calvin was, next to a Calvinist, they are hard work. It's called the Protestant work ethic. You know, give all to God. Now, my parents weren't really religious themselves. They just, like a lot of people, thought, you know, it's better to try to give him a religious education so he's good or whatnot. And but you know, I never believed in God. I can remember being 4 or 5 years old thinking, why are these people so stupid? I mean,
yeah. Did you attend, like, how often, till what age?
I went to Sunday school from the age of 3 to 9. I got a 7-year Sunday school pin. And you probably must have read that play that I sent around about, did you read the play that I did about the musical? Yes, where I had mentioned, because you're talking about that. I had a 7-year Sunday school pin. And then when I was 9 years old, I just said to my parents, I said, I don't want to go to church anymore. I don't believe this shit. You know, I didn't say shit. Yeah. My dad would have backed me, but I said, you know, I'd never believed in God. And they were like, you know, okay, whatever. And around a year or so later, they couldn't afford to send me to Lutheran school anymore. So I went into public school, and that led into all sorts of things. You know, the flow of life, this one thing leads into another thing. Lives are interesting. Even the dullest, dumbest person is going to be living a life arc. I spoke with a fellow from England that you saw the video of.
Yeah.
A couple weeks ago, and I talked about life worms. There's this theory of the block universe, that I was born in 1965, and let's say if I'm lucky enough I live 95 years and I die in 2060, another 40 some years, there's a 95-year Dan Schneider life tunnel that is somewhere like a worm in an apple in the cosmos. And that's everything that I ever did, everyone I ever knew, everything that I ever thought, every animal that I ever loved, when I met my wife, when my parents died, etc.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I also feel on, you know, similar levels, but more from a scientific perspective. You know, that's why I like astronomy so much. You know, but yeah, you're more into the mythical right now, what you said. But yeah, I mean, say for example, I was just doing some research, you know, and the logo, your, you know, Cosmoetica logo, it's Japanese, right?
Yeah, it's Japanese or Chinese. The Chinese call it the letter Nu, N-U. The Japanese call it Mu, M-U, like the lost continent of Mu. It basically means nothingness.
Nothing.
And that comes from my favorite filmmaker, Yasujiro Ozu. It's on his gravestone in Japan.
Yeah.
He believed that we all come from nothing and that we all return to nothing. Just like there's the belief that the cosmos arose from nothing and it will one day return to nothing. And I can't prove it, but I think it's as good an idea as any. And Ozu is one of those guys who was a great filmmaker, but he's also a filmmaker that I like. I think I previously talked with you about the difference between like and quality. Ozu is someone that I really like. He's got, as far as I know, 5 or 6 really great films, maybe even more. I haven't seen all of his early stuff, but Ozu is someone who resonates with me. His little kids that fart and yell at their parents is, even though his stuff is mostly in the 40s and 50s, his greatest films, there's something that resonates. And then also he had the great Japanese actress Setsuko Hara, who, if I could go back in time, I'd want to marry her.
Yeah. So basically, that's an inspiration, you know, Ozu. But does it have any relevance with like nihilism, nothingness, like that, or you're talking about actual?
No. I mean, it's not a nihilistic viewpoint. It's nothingness as a good thing. There's also the idea, for example, if you follow or read up on cosmic theory, that the universe sums to nothing, meaning that just like you have equal amounts of matter and antimatter, if you put them together, they would be zero. So let's say you have however many quintillion metric tons of matter out there, or probably quintillion, you have equal amount of antimatter, or well, actually matter, I guess, supposedly dominates in this universe, but maybe in the larger omniverse or multiverse, that everything sums to nothing. And you know, again, it's something that's unprovable at this point in time, but who knows, maybe it'll turn out to be true. It's at least an interesting philosophical concept, and given that so few people in so many areas even think about things of any depth. You know, it's at least a positive thing to be thinking about.
Yeah, yeah. I enjoy the interview. What I've observed is the flow. It goes well. It flows very well. Like right now, I've gotten into the groove. It's been like I think 10 minutes.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I like the flow.
You just have to talk normally. I often
Yeah.
I do interviews. A lot of people I've gotten. I've done 270 interviews, something like that, or close to 270, and I probably done over 300. But a number of people have backed out because they're just scared to appear on camera. Which I'm sitting here in my own little work office den, whatever you want to call it, and I'm comfortable. But even if I was on a subway or something in public, someone wants to listen. What the hell do I care? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I guess people are just more, I don't know, sensitive to public, criticism or whatever, like shy or something, and you're not that.
Or they are vain. Like, for example, I have this little mole on the side of my face. I don't know if you can see it yet, but I recently, in shaving it, cut it and whatnot. So I'm going to have to go to a dermatologist in a few weeks. But my wife was like, "Oh, that looks ugly. How could you be on camera?" Like in the whole of the cosmos, I'm going to worry if a few strangers are like, "Oh, he's got a nasty mole on his face." I mean, who cares? You got global warming. You've got corporations that are running rampant over this world. You have idiots and fascists, and you have all this bad stuff, garbage floating in the Pacific. And I'm going to worry about having a little unsightly mole for a few weeks until I can get it removed. Who cares?
All right, so I want to ask you this thing. So, see, because usually your opinion is so, I won't use the word harsh, but, I mean, objective and straightforward. So every time you praise something, it comes to my notice, like outright praise. And you have said this, I think, 2 or 3 times, that Memetic is a novel of universal significance, for starters. That's what you've said. Mm-hmm. So why? I mean, why Memetic? Is it because, I mean, it's huge, right? It's big. It's the size of the novel.
It's about 215,000 words. So it's a larger novel, probably about 550 to 600 pages in typical font. But I mean, if it was published today, it would still be a great novel. There are things that if they came out today and they didn't have a famous name to attach to them, they wouldn't. For example, a lot of the works of Shakespeare simply don't hold up. And think the English language that Shakespeare is the greatest thing ever. There's no doubt that Shakespeare wrote some great stuff. I would say he probably has a handful to maybe a dozen sonnets that are still great. His long poems have always sucked. His comedies have always been rabidly unfunny. And I would say he has 7 or 8 plays. You could maybe argue a dozen that are great. But they're a limited form of greatness because just like the Greeks before him, he expounded and expanded what the Greeks did. The modernists have expanded and expounded on what Shakespeare did. And that's what I'm doing in my plays, is I'm going far beyond this melodrama thing. But as far as Moby Dick, it's a very bold novel in the way it uses things. There were novels that I don't know if you've ever read the Tristram Shandy. It's a long novel.
I have. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Shandy is one of those novels that's an important book, and it has great moments in it. But if it was published today, would it be considered great? 50-50. The reason Moby Dick goes farther and deeper is that, number one, it presented more real people. Novels before Melville and before a lot of the people that came in the early to mid 19th century, especially in the English language, tended to present the royals, people of wealth, people of means. Why do you think most of all Shakespeare focuses on kings? And the few times he focuses on the average person, they're objects of ridicule. They're bumbling thieves or idiots, or they're slobs, or they're fools.
Oh,
even if you look at something like The Tale of Genji, which is a novel from Japan, Lady Murakami, that tends to be, quote unquote, what we might now call an elitist view of the world. That's not to say that the elites don't have a right to have the view. But if you look at Moby Dick, putting aside, I mean, it has the metaphorical content that it has so many different people. You have black people, you have white people, you have possible homosexuals, you have South Pacific Islanders, you have religious people, you have the crazy man in Ahab, You have the little black boy who's his assistant. There's this wide. I mean, there's no women other than in the beginning and you were there, but there's this wide array of that you didn't see in other novels. If you saw a black person in a novel published in America before Moby Dick, he was a shuffling fool. He was what we call here a house goon. He'd be like Yaza Masa, Yaza. But if you look at the characters there, the black people, the few black characters are just as important. They're normal people. So Moby Dick is important, and it shows some of its greatness in its very straightforward portrayal of people. Then there's the actual story. Well, let me just get to the metaphor before I get to the story. A lot of people have made some good points that Moby Dick also, because at the time, I think there were 31 or 32 states in the United States at the time it was published. There's 31 or 32 people on the boat, the Pequod, so that each of them represents one of the states. And I remember reading a long analysis of this and whatnot. I don't know how true it is, but it's an interesting point. So there's a political metaphor to it. There's also again, now the plot is what is it? On the surface level, it's about a crazy man going after this quote unquote monster, but Moby Dick is just an animal. Maybe because it's a whale, it's a smarter animal than if it had been a giant shark. But Moby Dick becomes this thing, what we call a desideratum. Ahab has to have Moby Dick's blood on his hand, and it's based on a real incident too, which is another thing. Is that it's one of the first what we call based on a true story kind of novels that really is great that I know of. Tristram Shandy is made up. Robinson Crusoe is totally made up, although there were people known to have been stranded on islands. The bulk of Robinson Crusoe is totally made up. And it's not as heavy-handed as other things. People will point to some things like the chapters that go on about the whaling industry or the scientific background. But these are things that give you, they work partly because they give you a pause from the narrative. Imagine it's sort of like having a bathroom break if you're watching Satan Tango, a 7.5-hour film by Bela Tarr. If you have to go to the bathroom 3 hours in, it's sort of like reading one of those chapters. But a lot of the chapters too, though, while they would be called intercalary chapters being inserted in, some of them have some of the best moments in there. There's probably the chapter that's always stuck with me, I think, is called The Grand Armada, in which we're up in the crow's nest with one of the sailors, and he's looking down, and the water is so clear around this island or wherever they are that he can see the whales below the surface, and he can see mother whales and the babies suckling on the mother, and the description is so beautiful and whatnot, and it has a larger metaphoric content, it has a more poetic content, and it brings you out. And the ability to go high and low in Melville is not as forced as, say, it is in Shakespeare. If you look at a lot of Shakespeare stuff, like King Lear, I think is a very overrated play. I don't think it's a bad play, but I don't think it's a great play. And the fact that you have the old man wandering on the heath and he's been betrayed by his daughters, and there's a lot of it that we've seen before and seen since, and some of it has been better. Moby Dick, in a sense, while people have used the chase and the person going crazy and trying to get revenge about something, the Wrath of Khan, the Star Trek movie is an obvious example. It's never been done better, and I think 160 years plus on, or not even 170, it was 1851, so almost 170 years on. It's something that's still, if it had been just discovered today in a footlocker and published, and someone said there was this guy named Melville. Well, remember Melville, who wrote all those pretty good novels and what? Well, here's something that he wrote that he never published. It would be a revelation, it would be a literary find today. So. And I could go on if I had the book and whatnot, but those are the top 4 or 5 reasons.
What do you think of Joseph Conrad? Have you read any of his books?
Yes, I've read The Nigger, the Narcissist. I've read the Spy one, obviously Heart of Darkness. I've read his top 4 or 5. Conrad is impressive, and again, Heart of Darkness is one of those things, just like Moby Dick, that has. Apocalypse Now is the thing based on it most obviously. The most impressive.
But by length, it's so much shorter than Memetic, right?
Well, yeah, it's only like 35,000. It's a novella technically, but the most impressive thing about him is he grew up Polish. He wrote Polish. English was his second language. And the fact that this guy for whom English is a second language, Conrad, arguably, if you go, I guess you could consider him a modernist, an early modernist, but by the time he was writing around 1890 to 1920, I think was his heyday. It's a remarkably impressive thing that he did. He did The Agent. Is it called The Secret Agent? I forget the. Well, anyway, he did things there, and he brought in things deeply. When you read Conrad, he wasn't afraid to show that human beings are ugly and mean. There's another guy whose name slips on mine. There's a famous silent film called Greed that was based on a novel.
It's by the famous director. I'm forgetting his name. Greed, right?
Let's see. Greed film. Let me just look it up here. But I know that Greed film, Erich von Stroheim directed.
Erich von Stroheim, yeah.
And it was based upon, I know, Frank Norris novel, McTeague. McTeague and Frank Norris, he's not well known here, even in America. Frank Norris was a very underrated writer. Jack London in that era was very underrated. Stephen Crane as a writer.
Well, just 1 second. I'm taking I'll take the note. Frank
Norris. Norris.
All right.
Stephen Crane, Crane, Stephen with a PH. Right. And Jack London. Jack London is probably an example of someone who has been, he's been called a racist and an imperialist and whatnot. But I mean, all of these guys would have these assumptions. Today, someone watching us talking in 120 years might look back and say, boy, that Dan and Rishi, boy, a couple of ignorant bastards back then. You can't help that. You have to look at the positive and what they go beyond. I mean, it's like here in America, a lot of people will say, well, that the founding fathers were racist. That Abe Lincoln was a racist. Well, of course, he was born in 1819 or 17, whenever the hell he was born. But in spite of being a racist, he still did the right thing, even though he knew it was going to cost, hundreds of thousands of lives. And I say to these people, yes, he was ignorant, but he was a man of his time. What have you done in your life that's going to look good in 150 years? Yeah. He was more ignorant, but he couldn't help it. If Lincoln had been born in 1965 like me, I can virtually guarantee you that you can look from his writing and his thoughts and his deeds. He was a smart man. He would have looked in the science books and he would have said, boy, I was taught really stupidly. Most people are the same. If you look, but people don't get it. They get off on, I'm this little shit now, a troll online, so I'm going to say that this person was a terrible person, that person was a terrible person. It's like when I've talked about Genghis Khan. You can't compare Genghis Khan, even though he killed tens of millions of people, with someone like, say, Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun was just a killer. He was like the Al Capone of Eastern Europe, the Al Capone of the Roman Empire. But Genghis Khan, if you actually look into it, he killed a lot of people. So did Alexander the Great. So did Cyrus the Great. Most of the people who were leaders of nations then were genocidal people. They wanted to get rid of the others. But Genghis Khan was the first guy and the first major empire that had religious tolerance. He reformed things. He did things for the average Mongol or the average Chinese peasant that made their lives better. Basically, unlike someone like Attila the Hun or Alexander the Great, he said, if you accept us and don't fight us, we won't harm you. And Genghis Khan and most of the Khans and Kublai Khan did the same thing. but if you went against them, they would annihilate you. So, and I'm not saying, now you can say, yes, he's still a mass murderer. But Genghis Khan is someone who is different than Attila the Hun. He's also different than the Hitlers and the Stalins and the Mao Zedongs. Yeah. But people don't want to see nuances. It's easy to lump things together.
Yeah. So coming back to topic, so why do you think, I want your perspective, why do you think a writer like Frank Norris and Stephen Crane is not as well known as Jack London or Joseph Conrad? Why? Like, is it luck? Is it what?
Well, so you said Crane and London. With Jack London, it's a very simple thing. Jack London was enormously influential in the first half of the 20th century. Call of the Wild, White Fang, are books that in America were taught almost religiously. But then once the 1960s came on, he became sort of America's equivalent of Rudyard Kipling. He became the source of the white man's burden and whatnot. And on top of that, he also plagiarized some stuff from lesser writers. He admitted that he plagiarized, but this now has become a mark against him as well. So the fact that a lot of his writing has that, well, I am the great conquering white man, and also that he admitted to plagiarism has made him persona non grata. Well, throughout the stuff that he admittedly plagiarized, and just take a look at the individual stuff. This is a guy, that wrote better science fiction novels than a lot of more famous science fiction writers. Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but this was a guy who just didn't write about wolves and cold weather. He wrote over an immense amount of subjects. As for Stephen Crane, like what's his name, London, was well known in the early half of the 20th century in the U.S. Basically because of the Red Badge of Courage. In more recent, the last 50 years, his quote-unquote poetry, which he called his lines, have become fairly well known within the sort of intellectual academic poetry circles. But he didn't have the output that London did. And I think simply probably Red Badge of Courage was one of those things that were just shoved down people's throats, that people are now, writers and all artists, if they are praised to the hilt in their lifetimes, once they die, they're inevitably going to have where they're going to go. People are going to be like, oh, the hell with him. Then 50 or 100 years go by and someone says, let's take a look at him. Now, if the person is really good, they'll rise back up. If not, they'll stay where they are. And the reverse is true, too. Sometimes you've had people, Emily Dickinson is a great example. Unknown in her lifetime, published, I think, one poem. Then she was published, and her work was Baudelarized. It was, made safe for people to read. Then she became well known as writing this very beautiful flowery verse. Then they published the real versions of her poems, which feminists and people who were into poetry like, and she's been elevated to the point of Walt Whitman. Now, I think she's way overrated. In this interview I did a couple of weeks ago, with this English kid, I said, Elizabeth Barrett Browning is a better female writer. She wrote a whole novel in verse, which is an outstanding book. A novel in verse that's a feminist novel in verse, written I think in 1848 or 47, called Aurora Leigh. This is way ahead of its time. It's far beyond anything that what's her name could have done, Emily Dickinson. And yet, because Emily Dickinson is quote unquote the Eve of American poetry, Walt Whitman, at least for modernist poetry, Whitman and Dickinson are the Adam and Eve. They are the mythic founders of modern American poetry, even though they're totally different. And even though Whitman, I think, is far better than Dickinson. But now I think the reputations are coming down. I've also mentioned in that last interview I did about abstract expressionism, Jackson Pollock and a lot of the abstract expressionists, painting-wise, their reputations are starting to sink, thankfully.
All right, and okay, so yeah, we just went on a tangent there, but
I'm wanting to do that.
So tell me, the question I actually put it down. So tell me, I'm heavily into science fiction. That's my genre. So I like H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, and right now when you said that Jack London was also a sci-fi writer, and so who else can?
Project Gutenberg. You can find all of Jack London's stuff on Project Gutenberg.
Yeah, yeah. And definitely, yeah. And I love sci-fi. So, okay, one more thing I want to ask you is now many critics, and this is one guy, grumpy old man. He's got a blog, and so he praised you, and what he said was the gist of what he said was you thoroughly review and analyze every film or every poetry. And he also mentioned the example of the Life of Pi book, which was written by some Brazilian guy, and so all the critics around the world are praising the originality, the story, the concept, and you said that it's plagiarized by this guy, the Brazilian guy,
Mm-hmm.
So it just this example, is what I asked you last time also, is that isn't there just too much content? Like we are overwhelmed with a lot of novels and stories and films and the real talent, like your plethora of things are getting buried. They are getting buried.
Yeah. And I tell my wife that time will salvage that there are things now known as cyber archaeologists, but there is too much. And this goes to the belief system that everyone is creative. Everyone has a story.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone has a story, but most stories are dull. I can take it, I've lived, I would say, a more interesting life than most. But even if let's say I had just been raised in privilege by a nanny and whatnot, I have enough imagination apparently and talent that I could still make my life interesting if I were to write about it. But this idea, I mentioned LeBron James, the basketball player, so you know who that is.
Yeah.
My wife came up with this metaphor that people who say that everyone is creative would call me an athlete for walking down my driveway to get my mail from my mailbox, because walking is an exercise, and LeBron James as an athlete is exercise, but it's at a totally different level.
Oh yeah.
The 6 or 7 year old who writes a little 2 or 4 line rhyming poem is not a poet in the same category as I am. The kid who does little finger painting dads or whatnot is not going to be in the same category as Johannes Vermeer, the painter, or Dali, Salvador Dali, or these great painters. But people want to believe that everyone is special. When we say people are equal here in the United States, technically, we mean people are equal under the eyes of the law. That would mean that if you and I supposedly went before a judge, if you were living in America, that we would both have the exact same opportunity to prove our innocence. Now, here in America, because you have darker skin and you have a funny sounding name, Hrishikesh Jha, it's not, Joe Smith, you would more than likely suffer some kind of bias that I might not. Maybe not as much as a black person here, an African American, but you would be somewhere in between the African American person and me in terms of the chance that you would get actual justice. That's because people are bigoted. Judges are bigoted. Juries are bigoted. I even, for example, when I lived in a state called Minnesota for 12 years, because I still have a little bit of a New York accent, I experienced bigotry because people thought that I was going to act like Joe Pesci from Goodfellas, and start a fight or whatnot just because of my accent. These are biases, as far as we know, arose as shortcuts that if we heard rustling in the breeze, it might be a saber-toothed tiger or a bear or a pack of wolves that want to eat us. So run away. But now that we've gotten to the point where we don't have to worry about being, packs of dire wolves coming and ripping us to shreds, we have to learn that our biases are not particularly good things anymore. Yes, we should have been afraid. If I was the head of one clan of cave people and you were the head of another clan, and we both wanted to drink from the same stream or whatnot, and one of my people was pissing in the river, and your people were seeing his piss float by, you might not be happy. But we don't have to kill each other over it anymore. We can just come together and say, okay, Rishi and Dan, let's, on Mondays, your people use the river, the next day our people use the river, and so forth. This is how laws came into effect and whatnot. But a lot of people still, it's very easy to, ooh, he's got a strange name. Now, sometimes it works in reverse. Suppose there's a girl who's got a fetish, and ooh, Hrishikesh. I like that. People have these weird kind of. I've had girls who like the way my eyeglasses look or something. but anyway, that's just human beings are biased, and there's nothing you can do
But
about it.
I mean, I wouldn't even use the word bias. I would just say it's genetic or biology. Don't you think it happens in animals also, right? They have packs and they don't, like, they kick someone out if they touch,
Well, yeah, I think
biologically or genetically speaking.
but it's a failure of us not to use our brains to rise above
Oh
it.
yeah.
The thing is, my cats, if my cats, for example, are at the windowsill and they see a bird out there, my cats go, "Rrr," and you can see their lips going, "Rrr." They want to get that bird. They don't have the rationale to say, maybe I should go get a snack or one, because they're not going to get the bird. They're not going to be able to go through the glass in the screen to get the bird, but they act simply on instinct. But I should, as an intelligent human being, be able to say, I'm not going to just, fall prey to my own worst tendencies.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's strange, but like people are so similar. Like you said, you remove nationality or scale, like religion and all those things, and and those are social constructs anyway. So
yeah.
All right. So okay, on the topic of science, I wanted to ask you this Thomas Kuhn's book. What's the book called? You mention it everywhere.
Scientific Revolutions, you probably.
Yeah, and I looked it on Amazon, and it's apparently very big and huge. So is it like a big book or something? And when did you read it? At what age? And how? Like.
Oh, I think the book came out late 50s, late 60s, at least half a century ago. I probably.
Oh, yeah. I just read the Wikipedia article. It came out in 1962. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I read it probably in the late 70s when I was a teenager in junior high. I had a great junior high school teacher, a science teacher. His name was Ronald Wallenfels. He was everything that a teacher should be. I just digress for 30 seconds. Two incidents stand out that made him a great teacher. One was that he once brought a Vietnam veteran friend of his into the class, and the veteran gave a little story of how he had to kill a child so that he could, a Vietnamese child, so that the child might not go back to his village and report that American troops were in there, because they could have been Viet Cong. And it was a very powerful moment. And the other thing that I remember is he brought in a glass jar with formaldehyde with a human fetus in it, and he explained the difference as to why this was a fetus. This is human tissue, but it's not a human being. This guy, this is everything you want from a teacher. And I believe it was this guy, Ronald Wallenfels, who might have been the fellow. It was either him or maybe it was another teacher, but I think it was Mr. Wallenfels who told me and a few other kids to read this Structure of Scientific Revolutions. The basic thrust of it being that ideas in science, but it can be applied elsewhere, go through several stages. That first they're rejected outright. Oh, that's just silly nonsense. Then after some time goes by, they're like, well, let's take a look at this silliness. Then some more times go by, they're actively engaging it. Then as more time goes by, it's like, well, that silly idea, that was right. It becomes accepted as right. Then what happens? The silly idea becomes dogma. And so you go from total shit to believing in the thing as dogma. And then some new idea has to come along that will upset the dogma. And so this is how things go around. And it's because human beings are so goddamn predictable, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens in the arts. Same thing happens in politics. Look at what they call climate change or global warming. I mean, there are people who still deny that human beings are affecting the global warming. The Greenland ice cap is going to melt. The seas are going to go. The sea level is going to go up by probably 20 to 30 feet. If Antarctica totally melts in another 50 years, it's going to go up, another 150 to 200 feet. We're going to lose all of Florida. We're going to lose London, New York. Your city, Mumbai, is going to be underwater. And all of Bangladesh will be gone. People are going to be like, how do you not accept this is science? I always say, stop being such fucking monkeys. Stop thinking that some God is going to, we can change it. We can do it. But what's probably going to happen is going to take another 10 years or so before governments get on the ball. And, but anyway, that's it about.
Oh yeah, but I think before that something natural might happen. Who knows? I mean, like something of huge catastrophe would get people's attention.
Well, people, I think human beings are such navel gazers. You know, I wrote a little article about what would happen if life was discovered back in '01, 18 years ago, and I posited that if life was discovered, that we would have a sudden race to try to get to the nearest star or that star where it was, because we'd want to exploit the resources. And I think I was a bit wrong in thinking that it would matter, because in the interim, the last 18 years, the internet has exploded. And I think, for example, if we got proof, let's say, that there was life on a planet, we saw the photochemical signature of the planet, and it could only have been caused by life, most people would be like, oh, that's interesting. There's life on another planet or whatnot. But when's the latest Avengers movie coming out?
Yeah.
In all honesty, I don't think your average person here in the West, and especially, they don't give a fuck. They don't.
I know. Yeah, I mean, not just the West, everywhere. You're saying America, but trust me, it's much worse everywhere. Like, you know, that's most people. That's like, yeah, I mean, that's why maybe you're so frustrated, like, because just to walk among them, you feel like you're operating on a different plane, right?
Well, at the job that I work at, I mean, I've got a boss who's one level over. He's a good guy, but most of the rest is they just walk around in fogs. They just And my wife says, just be a zombie. And I told her it's difficult though for me to be a zombie. Though I when I see things in my play that I'm writing today, I was just working over a section about a week or two ago, 2 times driving to work early in the morning, around this time in the morning or earlier. One time, a skunk ran out into the road, and it sort of hit, when it saw my car coming, it sort of hit in the ball, and I went around it. I swerved so that my wheels went, I missed it. A few days later, a second skunk comes running out, and I think it came out of nowhere, just a darted across, and I think I might have nicked it on the side. It probably ended up either dying or somewhere, and I felt bad about it. But it stuck with me, and I put it in this play. And if you read all of my stuff, whether novels or plays, you can get a sense of what was going on exactly in my life. These little incidents that the characters describe are almost always things that happened to me and my wife. Now, why do I do that? It's because this is what connects to people. In 1,000 years, if your descendants, if you have children and grandchildren, if they're born and they're around some space station, around another star, if they read my book, they might read about that little skunk. And maybe there's some named animals on this planet that one of them might have accidentally killed. And they'll feel the same thing that I felt about accidentally hurting or possibly killing this little animal. And that connects. And to get back to Moby Dick, there were moments like that in Moby Dick that connect. Yeah. That in a lot of other, even some great stuff, you don't get. What's his name? The Man of La Mancha, Miguel Cervantes, Don Quixote. Even in a book like that, which has great moments and is one of the most important works of fiction up until that point in the early 17th century, you don't get those moments of recognition that you do in something like Melville. Melville, even though he came 250 years after Cervantes, there's a big gulf between them. And that's one of the things that makes Moby Dick special, just to get back to it. But go on. Yeah,
but this is a fantastic point, what you said, but when you give the example of comparing why Moby Dick resonates with you, and if you give the example of in the future someone reads about that animal, do you think that there is an equivalent of this sort of that feeling of Moby Dick in cinema? Can you say, like, maybe Terrence Malick? Does Terrence Malick have that, or where you feel, oh yes?
A lot of the best films do. Have you ever seen La Dolce Vita by Fellini?
Yeah, I have.
So there's that moment. A lot of people. What really amazes me, if I were to pick, say, the 2 best films that I've ever seen, be La Dolce Vita and 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, I think both of these films are horribly and critically not given the due. Yes, 2001 is often and rightly called the best science fiction movie, but it's called dull, it's called unemotional. Yet, if you look at some of the scenes, and I think I might have said this the last time, that when Hal is getting lobotomized in the Red Room, I feel Hal. When you have, there's a scene where Hal is speaking to a reporter back on Earth, and one of the astronauts says, Hal seems, the the TV guy says, Hal seems to take a bit of pride in what he said. And the astronauts say, yes, he did. There are little moments that give you clues to character that if all you're seeing is, oh, these are two guys scraping green goop to eat, you're going to... In La Dolce Vita, for example, one of the criticisms about that film is that there's no narrative. Well, what do you mean there's no narrative? You have a main character. He goes through a series of adventures. He has a compelling arc, and he has other characters that appear in different scenes. The film starts off with him having sex. Well, it's the second scene, sex with this beautiful woman played by Anouk Aimee. She's a rich girl. And then towards the end, at the party, there's that great scene where she leaves him alone in a room, and she goes to another room, and she's speaking into a fountain. And because of some acoustical oddity, he can hear what she's saying. And so she's saying something, and then another guy comes in and starts fondling her. And he's saying, I want to marry you. I want to marry you. I love you, and whatnot. And she has no idea that she's getting felt up by this other guy. And it's such a great moment that gives you insight into both of these characters. And there's the little girl that he's typing. There's so many more. And then she comes back at the end with the monster that's pulled up, and she's waving. He can't hear what she's saying, and he doesn't care because he's such a dilettante and such a fop that his life is doomed. These are these little moments that stand out. But people want explosions. They think a character arc is having someone crying at a bed when someone's dying. I've interviewed enough actors. As actors call those the money scenes that they send into Emmy Awards or Oscar Awards. You have Bollywood type awards. Those are the easy scenes for actors. The hard scenes for an actor are those scenes which there's no clear motive that the actor, an actor, if they're good, has to bring to a scene. It maybe someone has just died in the film, and the next scene is going to be them meeting someone new. But in that scene where they're in a bar and they're sitting alone and they're just looking at the camera, how are they looking? How are their shoulders? Are they slumped? Does the way they look, does the grimace on the face say something? That's where good acting really comes in.
Now we're on this topic of La Dolce Vita in 2001. Suddenly, like, two new questions came in my head, So I'll ask you the first one. Now, first one is again connected to how you said, you gave the example of you saw that cat or something, and you want the people in the future to experience that, feel it. And again, I bring this up because last time also we discussed this. I still feel that, at least in film, it's a technical element, the atmosphere of La Dolce Vita, or even 2001, the camera, the way it's played. Don't you think that's the case? That also adds. I saw a film recently called The Carnival of, it's like a woman walking, and black and white, 1962.
I mean,
Carnival of Soul. A Carnival of Soul.
Carnival of Souls. Oh, you watched that? Yeah, Carnival of Souls.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, now that's not a great film the way the other two films you mentioned are, but it's a great little what I would call a genre film. It's a horror film. And is this woman crazy? It turns out that she's actually dead, and she seems to be a spirit, and the spirits want to come and bring her there. And there's the great moment here when you want to talk about technical. The sound disappears when she's walking. She's in a department store. She's running around, and she sees the odd zombie guy sort of looking at her. And there's that. I mean, there's a great example of not having a big budget, but having good ideas together. Now, it can technically be done, but sometimes all you have to do is just point the camera at a great actor. If you've got a really great actor and you say, okay, your wife just died, you're about to lose your job or whatnot, and you're sitting alone in a bar, and some total stranger comes up to you. How do you react? This is when I'm writing plays. One of the things that I think a lot of playwrights don't do is not give enough avenues for the actors, because I can write a great monologue, but I have to be able to give a little bit of cushion for the actors to do something, so that if you went to see my play being produced 2 or 3 days in a row, each thing would be a different experience. I want that to be there, and I want, as a collaborative art, I want the actors, I want the stage director to be able to put a little bit of their own stamp on it, so that a production in St. Louis, a production in Mumbai, a production in Leningrad, well, now it's St. Petersburg, a production in Sydney, Australia, are all going to be a little bit different because they have different actors and they have a different concept of how to do it, you know?
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, and I agree, but the point I was trying to make is that from a filmmaker's perspective, like how you said that it should affect the person who's going to read your words, the poetry or the read. So that way, from a film point of view, technically the way I show it, you know, and I feel that the examples you gave work technically, at least the slow zooms, the slow panning, you know, not like how today movies have cut and all that, you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be a technical thing. I mean, most famously, if you watch a film like Touch of Evil by Orson Welles, a famous train shot that goes for 6 or 7 minutes. And that establishes that whole world milieu. A similar shot is the long shot in Goodfellas where Ray Liotta and his girlfriend enter the restaurant, and they go through the restaurant, and they say hi to the servers, and then they say hi to everyone else, and then they finally sit down.
Or any of Robert Altman's films. Like every time I'm watching them, I feel like I am inside the movie. Like, you know, I'm observing them. It's natural. Like you, the director you mentioned, John Cassavetes or someone, the natural flow, right?
Well, with Cassavetes, he's a good example of doing more with less. If you've ever seen the Cassavetes film Faces, which was in black and white, he would let things go on. He would script a scene, say, that might run 2.5 minutes or whatnot, but he'd let sometimes he'd go to the actors, keep going on, especially if something was going right. He would say, if you feel it, if you feel that you can add something more, go on, because he could just cut it off at the 2 minute and 30-second mark that he wants to.
Yeah.
But if that actor adds an extra 45 seconds and it's something brilliant, why not have that? Have that option when you're in the editing room. That film ends in what most people would say is a very dull manner. That film, if you've ever seen it, ends, I believe, the woman is sitting down, the husband walks over her to go up the stairs or maybe out the door or whatever it is, and then it just ends. I mean, there's no great swelling of music. There's no great fade out. It mimics reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this is your comment. You wrote somewhere, Paul Schrader's early writings are seemingly seminal. Now, I don't understand the meaning of the word seminal, but at the level of it, seminal, like fantastic, I mean, right?
What artist?
Paul Schrader. Paul Schrader's early writings are seemingly seminal, but at the level of a junior high schooler. Now, what do you mean? Like craftily he's good, do you mean, or what?
Well, for example, I think I was talking about the book that he wrote about film, which again slips my mind. Now, Paul Schrader, for those who don't know, is the guy who wrote Taxi Driver, and then he became a director of his own right. Mishima, the movie about Yukio Mishima, Mishima, how you pronounce it.
There was Cat People also.
Yeah, he did the remake of Cat People, which is not nearly as good as the original. But when I say the seminal is, and in a junior high way, his stuff is rather obvious. I either saw, or maybe, I'm trying to think, does Taxi Driver, he might have done the commentary on the Laserdisc or the DVD of Taxi Driver. But somewhere along the line, I was listening to one of his commentaries, or maybe I watched a YouTube video of his, and he talks about the film and whatnot. But Taxi Driver is a perfect example of something going beyond just the script. Okay, so we have the Vietnam veteran played by De Niro. Something's wrong with him. He probably is suffering from what's now called post-traumatic stress syndrome. We don't know where he comes from. Well, all we know is that he does have a mother and a father that he writes letters to and lies to about how great his life is going to. He has these delusional, violent fantasies, and somehow, after failing to assassinate a presidential candidate, he ends up killing a bunch of mobsters and pimps and scumbags, and he becomes a media hero, which is a perfect. I mean, that's sort of what Donald Trump is like in a certain sense. Someone who's a bad person who gets rewarded for it. But hearing Schrader talk about things like that, you would think that the thing was his whole idea, that it was somehow unique, that it was somehow some great insight. But for example, the most famous scene in that film is the "You talking to me?"
Yeah.
You talking to me? And
Yeah.
from everything I've ever read, 90% of that was De Niro just
improvising. Yeah.
And Scorsese saying, "Go for it, Bobby." And a number of other scenes are just like that. For example, remember one of the key scenes in that film is he's taken Sybil Shepherd to a porno film. He's on the telephone. She rejects him. And what does the camera do?
Yeah, I know.
Goes away.
Yeah.
And we hear it in the sort of cracking of his voice. We know what she's saying to him. She's saying to him, "You're fucked up and whatnot." And we can hear the breaking of the man. And this is the thing that sets him off on his destructive pattern against a presidential candidate and to save the little girl played by Jodie Foster. Those are things that, even if they were in the script, it's the way it's done, and it's that's what you're meaning by technical. It's the fact that it moves away, and
exactly.
De Niro's great acting, that we only hear his voice cracking. We know he's getting crushed. He's emotionally being destroyed by this woman.
Yeah. But so many other things also, right? I mean, even the editing, even the time it's cut.
I forget her name, but Scorsese for the last 40 years has used a female.
Thelma Schoonmaker.
Right. Yeah, and she's a brilliant editor. She's one of those people that goes overlooked, but her editing in at least his classic films of the last century. I'm not a big fan of the last 20 years of him. I think he's doing a lot of his stuff he did better. But anyway.
Yeah, actually, one of my favorite Martin Scorsese films is one no one's heard of. It's called After Hours, 1985.
That's a great comedy. Yeah.
It's dark comedy, right? It's like I really like it, but most people haven't heard of it.
Yeah, and it's overlooked. The woman Catherine, she was from Second City Television. Catherine, I forget her name. She's terrific in that. The fact that this is when human beings were called computers. He's a human computer there.
Oh yeah. I mean, would you say that life was? I mean, I don't know. I'm asking this question, but like in the late 80s or 90s, was it better now? Like in every way, like society?
No. I mean, I've often said what happens is I mentioned about Lincoln being ignorant and being racist. Life is never as good as it could be because there are all these dumb people and selfish people and corporations and people who don't care about anyone for themselves, dragging things down. Then there are all these people who are moving forward. Okay, but if you went back, and I've said this to a lot of people, and I think I said it again to this kid I interviewed a couple of weeks ago. I said, if you think life is bad in 2019, go back to 1919. Go back to 1019. Go back to 19 AD. These are people that if I got bitten by the wrong bug, I'm dead. Yeah. If I get bitten by a bug today, I could still die if I don't do anything for 48 hours. But likely I'm like, holy shit, an ugly green bug just bit me. I better go to either the emergency room or the doctor or whatever. And going to the emergency room, they might screw me and it might cost me $500 or $1,000, but I'm not going to die.
Yeah. I mean, I don't mean it from that perspective, of course. I mean, even just recent as 100 years ago, lifespan was 50, 60 years? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, but I didn't mean from that way. I meant from a societal perspective, like the internet and the deluge of, the character of the person changes, right? Haven't you noticed like kids today are much different than in the 90s or in the 70s, like you were?
Yeah, I mean, but human beings adapt to their time. If you went back to 1950s America, people thought that television was going to dumb down people. That television was something that should be. There was in here in the U.S. there's something called the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. 1962, the head of that FCC was a guy named Newton Minow. He made a famous statement. He called television is the vast wasteland. Yet television in the early 60s was just hitting its stride. I think the 1960s and 70s in American television was the golden age. If I look at the stuff back from then, it's so much more intelligent than now. However, despite everything we say, there was no Project Gutenberg. I can look at 50 or 1,000 books free.
That's true. Exactly.
And the thing is, the reality is, and I've said this to my wife, is there was never a golden age. The people who are intelligent, the people who are creative, the great artists are always going to be in the minority. They have always been the minority. In 1,000 years, when we have human beings, cyborgs, and artificial intelligent robots, and we're all out there in space and whatnot, you know what? We're still going to have dumbasses. And you know what? Yeah. Also, despite artificial intelligence and despite the fears, and you can put this on record, Dan Schneider predicts, we are going to have dumb as fuck AIs. We're going to have AIs who are bigots. We are going to have AIs who are idiots. We are going to have AIs who espouse the worst ideas, because just because the intelligence is artificial and it has the potential to know more and whatnot, they're going to be lazy AIs. Yeah. There are going to be robots and cyborgs that have far more advantage than I. They'll have Project Gutenberg in their head. They'll just be able to go, and they'll be able to quote as if they know it. They'll be able to quote, but they'll still be stupid, because there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is just the facts. Wisdom is, how do I use those facts?
Oh yeah, that's a great comment. Yeah, it's like pearls of wisdom, you know. But I mean, you know, at the same time, you know, I feel that so much technology, and because the example I gave, you gave of the teacher, you know, something like that, your teacher showing you the embryo and all that cannot happen today. You know, it just can't. He'll be kicked out of the. What?
I said probably not in the U.S. where they believe that a fetus is a human being. But I mean, in countries that value science, if you're in Scandinavia, if you're in Western Europe, I don't know about India, but if you're in Japan, if you're in Australia, people aren't going to feel that. I mean, but anyway, go ahead. Continue.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So we are, okay, I'll change the subject. So we were on the AI future topic, and I love that. It's one of my favorite topics. So I researched this Lifeboat Foundation in Reno.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Well, so you're honorary member or something, like you contribute to their.
What happened was this fellow named Howard Bloom, who I've interviewed a few times. Howard Bloom is a guy who, on the one hand, is one of the smartest people you'll ever meet. On the other hand, a lot of people rag on him because he's pro-Israel, and he wrote. I wouldn't say. I guess some people, his critics would call him Islamophobe, but. He's always been nice to me and one. And so he apparently joined this Lifeboat Foundation organization 4 or 5 years ago, and he recommended me for it. And I was like, okay. So I said, I joined it and whatnot. And I went on, I said, well, what are you people going to do? All it was a bunch of people with master's and PhD degrees, and a few people who'd even won Nobel Prizes or the equivalent prizes from other countries. And all they're doing is gossiping. And they don't do it. They get this money and whatnot. They have this really, I mean, people talk about Cosmoetica looking outdated, a website that looks as outdated or more so than my website. They don't do a damn thing. I remember 25 years ago, a cousin of mine, I had a cousin, a natural cousin from my natural family. She was a member of Mensa, and Mensa is the high IQ society of the world. And she wanted me to join Mensa. Now, I had taken an IQ test when I was a kid, and I remember that, and I think I might have, did I take one then? But I remember there were a lot of questions I just objected to them, and I only landed in like the 93rd or 94th percentile. You have to be in the 98th percentile. But I went to one of their meetings, and these people were fucked up. There were these nerd guys playing chess, arguing who was the greatest General Leo Grant. There was this tall, attractive blonde woman. I was wearing a turtleneck shirt at the time. I went in there. She comes up to me and she starts rubbing my chest. And I'm like, okay. And she said, I like your chest. I like your pectorals. Okay. And it was just a bizarre thing. This Lifeboat Association, just like the Mensa group, shows that you can be intelligent. And this is one of the problems with life. You can have people who are intelligent, but they have a laser thin intelligence. This is when people talk to me about Albert Einstein being such a great intellect. Albert Einstein was a great mathematician and physicist, but read Albert Einstein's writings on anything other than math or physics. He's not that bright. He doesn't understand humans. He doesn't understand human society. He has no clue about the waves of history. Albert Einstein is just another guy outside of his field of specialty. This is why I hate the term genius. I hate that. you can have a genius. You could say Dan Schneider has a genius for words or a genius for writing, but that doesn't mean that if you put me, in some, I don't know, some computer class or whatnot, that I would be able to do anything, because I'd probably be bored silly, and unless you engage with something, you can't operate at your highest level. So the Lifeboat Foundation was a total joke. And I argued with a few people, and I said, take me the fuck off your list. And I didn't find out who. I think about 6 months later, I found out from Howard Bloom that he was the guy who recommended me. I said, I think a lot of people, it just sounds impressive to be part of a think tank, but they don't think they're just as stupid as a lot of people. This is one of the things I've said too, is that when I've argued with people, and people talk here in the US about quote unquote white trash or about poor people being dumb, I say the rich and the powerful are no smarter. I work for a company called American Telephone and Telegraph, or AT&T. It's the largest phone company in the US. And I remember 20 years ago, there was a guy who was the CEO. His name was C. Michael Armstrong. He came from a company called Comcast, which was then a cable company. He knew nothing about the telephone business. Within a year and a half, he was on a golden parachute. They kicked him out of the company because he almost destroyed the company because he didn't know anything about it. And it goes to show you can have someone who might be successful in one area. It does not augur any kind of success in any other area. Because I can write a great sonnet does not mean that I can beat LeBron James one-on-one in basketball. Because LeBron James can beat me in basketball doesn't mean that he could write a Norwegian in the Family.
Yeah. All right. So this is what you wrote. So I'm quoting. This is why I ask my series questions. This is the same questions over and again, such as those on Thomas Kuhn, the three intellect posit, the query on the decline of the interviews in serious culture, and the question on casualty that invokes Genghis Khan. Now, what does that mean? The last sentence, the question on casualty that invokes Genghis Khan.
You mean causality?
Yeah, causality. I'm sorry. Yeah, causality. Yeah.
Again, you reading me a sentence or two from some essay years ago. I can't put it into any context.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's my fault. Yeah, I took it and I
better off just sticking to broad topics, because unless we don't have the time here for me to reread things and put into.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. So yeah, I'll ask you about like your interview section of Cosmetica. First and foremost, your website is so vast. Like, I mean, I sometimes get overwhelmed, because they're like I've made them in 5 or 6 categories, but there's so much to to read. Yeah, but anyway, so I'll stick to the interview section, your interview section. So one question I took from you is not asking a lengthy question, and rather space it out into different questions. Like you said that by the 5th interview, you had figured this out, that you wouldn't ask the interviewee like a big question or something where he will go on a tangent or something.
Yeah. Well, and I got that actually from the written interviews more so than the video interviews. The video interviews, there was 5 years ago when I started the technical stuff, like we're recording this on Skype. Even just 6 months ago, I don't think Skype had a record feature. So things change and whatnot. So now, knock on wood, if things work out, you'll be able to see you and I side by side, like in that last interview with that fellow.
Yeah.
But I know when I was doing the written interviews, I sometimes would ask questions, and I would say, well, I wrote this kind of thing here, and I wrote that. And people took that as being huffy or haughty or being, patting myself on the back. And while it was, I can understand why they thought that way, because most people are not going to have read me. Most people are not going to have listened to my ideas or whatnot. You have to, in an interview, recognize that it's the Dan Schneider interview or the Dan Schneider video interview, but that particular episode is about that person and that idea. And interviews have 2 functions. One, if I'm let's say if Albert Einstein were alive, I'm going to interview Albert Einstein about his ideas on math and physics, but I also want to get to who Albert Einstein is. So you want to get to the thing that makes them notable, but also why they are. When I interview actors, for example, I often will ask personal questions. And then later on in the interview, I'll say, well, when you're doing a scene with on this kind of in this film, and you want to evoke something, or if you're on stage and the actor that you're working with is just phoning it in and not really giving it, how do you react to that? Do you do little things that maybe spur them to more? You have to be able to switch on a dime and be able to if someone brings something up, say, oh, that's an interesting point. Okay, I'm going to follow up on that. It's fun and it's interactive. I think most people don't do interviewing well because they usually have, if you've seen, you've got someone with a clipboard here and they're like, okay, question 1, now they're on question 17, but they don't follow up. Now, if I had a list of, say, 30 questions, in a really good interview, I might only go for the top 16 or 17 questions, and the rest of the interview will be follow-ups or tangents that I go off on.
Yeah.
If you're interviewing me and I talk about something that happened when I was 8 years old, and you say, well, that reminds me of a story that Dan wrote, or I think I read it in an essay. Let me ask and make a connection between the two. That's more interesting than just going on asking a real question, because I mean, you can only, I've talked about, there's a dozen or so major things that I keep hammering home when I talk, especially to young people who want to Skype with me or something. But you have to be able to go into the filigrees of life, these little things that go on. I can talk about how unfair it is that my wife, Jessica, and that I'm stuck working a job and whatnot. I keep telling, Emily Dickinson was a nut job. Yes, she was well off for her time, but she was stuck in her home. Walt Whitman, died, I don't think he died with any wealth or whatnot. This is the way that society has always treated people who have a bit more. I think it's partly out of envy for those few that recognize it, but for the masses of people, they don't. I could walk here in America, and if I said Stanley Kubrick, literally, he's only been dead 20 years. Literally, anyone under 40, there'd probably be 1 or 2% of people that under 40 who know who Stanley Kubrick is. Even though he's often considered the greatest American filmmaker, if not the greatest filmmaker.
Yeah, I know. I mean, again, I'm pushing my agenda, but I always feel that the reason all this technical achievements, so much YouTube content is going to only make matters worse. Like maybe with the future generations, they won't even know. One reason they don't know is because they have so much content to, so many video games, so many this, that. But anyway, that's an off topic. So yeah, one more thing I wanted to ask you. So you said that, but it's amazing how, what I love about your interviews, first I came to know you is through the interviews, is you are so analytical and you put so much effort. But at the same time, you have to understand that the other person, the interview will not be in the same mindset, right? They'll be like, they have thousands of things on their minds. They're just not that deep. Even some of your own interviews, you have said, like, this guy was just miserable. He was just bad, right? But don't you think that's like, I mean, if you're putting so much effort and so much, of your energy, I don't know, it should be guaranteed or something. It's like, you're bound to be.
Well, there's no such thing as guarantees. It would be, it's one of those things. There are people that, the woman, for example, that I interviewed, the name slips my mind. It's 100-something interviews ago. She was an interesting woman to interview. I was interviewing her about something about, I think she had written a book, and she then started, and it was something, it was a topic having to do with maybe paranormal stuff or what. Then she went on talking about how she goes on out-of-body voyages past Pluto. And so I think I asked her something like, well, because at that time we had just gotten the first images of Pluto, the planet, or the dwarf planet now, Pluto, from the Voyager or whatever spaceship went by. And I said, well, if you really could fly by there, why didn't you say, well, here's what Pluto looks like, and if you look in the northern hemisphere, you'll see this giant thing. If you have that ability, if you did that and that was confirmed, you're set for life. You could go to you could have a show in Las Vegas and but obviously she wasn't flying through space seeing Pluto and whatnot. But every so often you get these kinds of things. And I'll give you another example. There was a woman that I spoke to, and the subject was quote unquote transgenderism. Now I'm not a believer in gender. I think there's the male sex, the female sex, and then there's a few poor people who have born with both sexes, and they eventually have to choose whether they're going to be male or female. But here we have now people saying there's 127 genders or whatnot, which is absolute nonsense. And I was speaking with this woman who was pro-gender. She apparently knew this fellow Bruce Jenner, now called Caitlyn Jenner, who's probably the most famous transgender person in the world now. And I could tell. I asked a few questions about it, trying to be in opposition to it, and she wasn't having any of it. So what did I do? If you watch that interview, I switched my tactics, and I basically asked questions that had absurd premises that she would pick up on. And I think basically it's the old saying of giving a person enough ropes they tie their own noose and hang themselves. Someone watching in 50 or 60 years, when I think science will have caught up to what's wrong in someone's brain, a man who thinks they're a woman or vice versa, will probably have some chemicals or some biochemical therapy that will help these people without cutting off their genitals. That if I'm born a man and think I'm a woman, I just have to take this, or maybe they can shoot little nanoprobes in that will help balance the brain's chemistry or whatever it might take. But I just let this woman speak, and we'll see. 50 years from now, 50 years from now, her views on transgenderism may seem as silly as Abe Lincoln's on race. But I wasn't confrontational. I just let her basically go on because she was going to have none of. She was not going to listen to my objections. So let us have her say. And we'll see what time says that. So that's a good interviewer, knowing when you have a person who doesn't really want a dialogue. They just want to get up and make a speech. So let her make a speech and let her go down in flames if she's going to go down in flames.
Yeah, that's a fantastic perspective. And I asked you, you emailed Len Dobbs or Harry Pinker, right? Your set of questions.
Yeah, them. Yeah.
So that's the preferred, like with everyone, that's what you do, email.
Well, I haven't done a written interview for like 5 or 6 years. I did 41 or 42 of them, and that's what there was one guy named Larry, the guy who started, Larry Sanger, he's one of the co-founders of Wikipedia, and he was a bit odd because I sent a list of maybe 40 questions and whatnot, and he's like, I can't do this, I'm overwhelmed. He was having panic attacks with it, so he said you had to break them up into smaller bits. So I broke it up into maybe 7 or 8 questions each time, and it took him a few months, and after a year and a half or so of laboring over it, it's a pretty good interview. It's not as good as some of the other interviews, but it's just odd. I was talking about people who are camera shy. Here's a person who's not, there's no camera, but being asked these questions, he apparently had a nervous breakdown. And it's just interesting because these are things that I would never have guessed that a person could feel. And here's a guy who's seemingly accomplished. I mean, if you want to consider Wikipedia an accomplishment, but he had this total kind of breakdown. Steven Pinker was interesting. He gave a good interview. Lem Dobbs' interview is a really brilliant one because he sometimes doesn't answer the questions, as I recall. He goes off again on these bizarre tangents, seemingly, but shows who he is. That's the way he thinks. And so I think it works very well.
And of course, my favorite interview is the one I got to know you from, James Berardinelli, the reviewer, critic.
James Berardinelli, okay.
Yeah, I like him. I like his, he's a bit objective if you think about it.
Yeah, he seemed like a nice enough guy. Again, you can only, when I interview the people video, you get a sense of who they are. Some of my favorite interviews have been with female actors, the actresses, because I remember there's a few interviewees that the women are more apt to dig emotionally than the men. And there was a woman that I interviewed, a couple of them stick in mind. There was a TV show in the 90s called Babylon 5. I interviewed Mira Furlan, who played an alien. She was really terrific. I liked her. Then there was an actress named Michelle Green, who I interviewed. She was on LA Law in the 80s and 90s. And it was funny because in parts of the interview, it's almost like she was flirting with me. And if I had been single and we lived in the same town, I would say, "You want to go out sometime?"
Yeah.
But it was a 3-hour interview. She wanted to talk because she had never been taken seriously as an actress. She was always dismissed as a secondary actress on that show. She never got to be a big star. Now she's directing theater and whatnot. She's more fulfilled. And she was happy that someone wanted to take her seriously, her ideas. And that's always interesting.
Yeah, and this is again one point what I love about your interviewing them. You could sense the I don't know, I wouldn't use the word passion, but something. Even that the paranormal guy, Bart Steiner, and I could sense it from the words that he was saying, that he was probably happy that someone is doing so much, and he was so courteous, on top of that. So I think that's.
Yeah, you're talking about the written interview with the guy who's the famous. He was a good interview, and he seemed like a real nice guy. And again, he's one of these people who wrote probably 120 books on this subject, and he's sort of an encyclopedia of paranormal stuff. But yeah, it's easy to make fun of people. One of the things, I don't want to just interview academics. Probably 2/3 of my interviews are with people who are academics, but I like interviewing I interview some people with interesting websites. People who have self-published books that are interesting, even if I disagree with them. They generally are more apt to give good interviews, because if you're with a big publisher, you're like, well, I'm a famous author, blah, blah, blah. Whereas if you're interviewing someone who self-published a book with an odd topic, they are going to be grateful that someone is actually listening to them, and they are going to be more open. And a couple of times, one of the things I find the most interesting when I do some of these interviews is I've sometimes spoken with people who are so-called mentors. They have a master's degree or a PhD in whatever subject. They've been 30 or 40 years in academia. And this has happened probably 2-3 dozen times in interviews. I'll ask a question that seems rather obvious about the subject at hand, and they'll say, I never thought about that before. And I'm taken aback, and I think to them, I don't say it out loud, but I think, how can you have studied a subject for 30 or 40 years and never had that thought when it just occurred to me 20 or 30 seconds in?
Yeah. I mean, see, that's what I think. Your intellect is just different. You're just, I don't know, it's more probing or something. I mean, most people just don't operate on that level. It's impossible. I observe people. I'm very good at observing people,
Here's the thing, and I've said this before. I've got what I call a convective memory. I don't have a file drawer memory. You probably met a lot of people who can remember, last Tuesday you and I were at that bar, and you said to me, when so-and-so comes there, and they have that memory. They can go back and very detailed. I don't have that kind of memory, but I'm good at it. The memory that I'm good at is things like the skunks that I missed and then may have hit in the road.
Yeah.
Maybe years ago, if that had happened 25 years ago, maybe 5 years afterwards, I would have been in the middle of a poem line, and that would come to me. And this is why when you read, whether it's a poem, a story, a novel, or some of my plays, my mind acts the way a convection current, I don't know if you know, is like water that's heated on the top of an ocean will eventually sink to the bottom as it cools, and then it'll be at the bottom of the ocean for 20 years before it comes up again as new water forces up. And my mind seems to be able to pluck the right things to say at the right time, 95 times out of 100. But I would not have thought of that if I would not engage in an interview or engage in writing. I have to be doing something specifically that my mind goes in deep down into the fishbowl and pulls out the right thing at the right time. It's like if you've ever seen, I don't know if they have them in India, there's a kids game here in America where you can have like a little crane constructor thing, pull out a stuffed animal if you can get it, and you get it.
Oh, yeah. Even with candy bars and all those things. Yeah. Amusement park. Yeah. And you've said you might be writing a book on the series, The Art of the Interview or something, just a collection of, even now you already have 43, 44 of these in-depth interviews, right? So have you ever thought of like making a book, self-published book or something? I remember you using the word The Art of the Interview as a book.
I mean, maybe there are lots of things that I throw out. I mean, I have probably 3 or 4 dozen movie reviews that I've never posted online, and I'll probably end up doing like the Lost Cosmoetica reviews or something. Just put it out on Amazon. The only things that I'm not going to put online are things that might at some point make money, which are my longer novels. Because it would be nice if someone I mentioned to this last interviewee, and the best thing that could happen to me here in America is not to get a book published by just a publisher, because most of them get obscure. It would be to have someone who's a filmmaker come and do a documentary film on me. And one idea, I don't know if you've ever seen it, I did a 100-minute video 20 years ago of me writing a great sonnet.
Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah.
What I would like to do is
when you had a lot of hair, right?
Yeah, when I would love it if at some point, if there was a young filmmaker who wanted to do not only just a documentary, but I'd like to see a film of me writing a play, say a 30,000 word play, which might take 15, 20 hours. Have the camera on me, have another camera that's able to record what I'm typing, and then take that 15 or 20 minutes, or maybe it would be double that because of the two cameras, and have that raw footage, make a 2 or 3 hour film documentary of me writing it, but then also put online to do it, because that 100 minutes there, I would say, and is probably one of the top 10 or 20 most important pieces of video that's ever been. And I'm not trying to brag in it, but where else are you going to see someone who's an artist writing, creating it right there, explaining why? And sometimes I throw away a word or this, not. I explain why it works or why it doesn't work. And that was in real time, 100 minutes. And that, where else are you seeing the act of creation as it's going? This isn't Jackson Pollock just dripping paint all over it. This is explaining why this word works, why that metaphor works. And it would be great to do that in a longer thing like a play. And that's why I think, even more so than getting published, I would really love, if anyone watches this video, if you like Cosmoetica or you think Cosmoetica is good, find some filmmaker. It doesn't have to be an American. It could be a Japanese kid who is a fan of Cosmoetica. Come to America. I'll write a play for you and put that on, and then you can do the typical documentary about the website or me or whatnot. But that would be something that I think would, if it went to Cannes Film Festival or the Venice Film Festival or a festival in India, would be something that could be something that takes off. I'm not looking to get rich. And at my age, 55, I got 20 or 30 years. It would be nice to be able to just have a little extra money that I didn't have to work so hard, because there are more so than what I've written. I regret the stuff that I haven't been able to write because I haven't had the time, because I have to do this stupid shit, because this culture that we live in, both America and world, does not value art. I said this before. If you think back 1,000 years ago, you can probably think of works of art that remain. Think of who's the richest. Who was the richest person in Bulgaria 1,000 years ago? It doesn't fucking matter. Who was the most important politician in some obscure Chinese province 800 years ago? What does it matter? It doesn't matter. But people do the same mistake over and over again. They will ignore the great people, whether they're artists or scientists or leaders in some field in their own time, and they'll always go back and say, it's like if only we had another Albert Einstein in physics, if only we had another Vermeer in painting, if only we had another Mozart or Beethoven. But how about, I'll guarantee you, it's going to be rare, but there probably are a few dozen people now alive that, like me, are barely known. But in 500 years, they're going to be saying, this person, that person, Dan Schneider and whatnot, why were they ignored? But we keep doing the same stupid shit because we're navel gazers. We don't care about, when I say we, I mean collectively, humanity. We don't care about the important things until someone tells us it's important. Moby Dick, most people who would read Moby Dick without any knowledge of Melville would have no clue whether it's good. They might feel a little bit more than they would reading a bad novel. But until they get the imprimatur of some critic or some person in authority saying, this is good, people aren't going to understand it. Perfect example, Andrei Tarkovsky is considered one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. He was considered the pride of the Soviet Union until the last couple of films when he was thinking about defecting. But he was boosted. He was boosted by the Communist Party. Imagine if Tarkovsky had been on the outs with the communists and was a rogue filmmaker there. He would probably be alone. He probably wouldn't have had the funds to do what he did. And we would be without Tarkovsky's 5 or 6 films.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. All right. So I'm done. I just wanted to ask you one question. So how many hours do you write on a day, on an average? Like, if you could take a guess.
It depends. Yesterday, I didn't do anything. I was too tired when I came home, and I went to sleep a few hours after I came home. I had some things to do. 2 days ago on Thursday, I had most of the day to write. I wrote about 12,000 words. And like today, I did 2,000 before we talked, and
So how do you get the, I don't know, motivation? How do you do it? Keep doing it every day. Do you smoke pot, like, or weed or anything? Never.
I never. I only had smoked a joint once when I was 11 years old, and I think I wanted to vomit.
Okay.
No, it's what I am. If I was,
yeah.
I am an artist. I am a writer, and that's what I do. I tell my wife Jessica all the time, stop. She wants to be known. She wants fame. She wants people to. I'm like, you can only control what you control. You're an artist. Yeah. That's what you do. Like I said, I had more time to do it, but it is what it is. And
yeah. So I'm done. It was great.